Nathan Lewis stepped out of his sleek black car, taking in the sight of the luxurious Sunset Crest Resort. The sprawling property, known for its opulence and exclusivity, was nestled along the coastline, offering pristine views of the ocean and all the extravagance one could imagine. This was a place where the rich and influential came to relax and conduct business, where million-dollar deals were made over cocktails at sunset. But today, Nathan wasn't here for leisure, and he wasn't just any guest. He was the resort's new owner. Nathan had built his success from the ground up. As a black entrepreneur, he knew all too well the hurdles he had to overcome. Prejudices, stereotypes, and constant doubt surrounded him in every industry he entered, but he never let it deter him. Now he was a well-known figure in the business world, his name synonymous with innovation, success, and determination. But today, he chose to visit the resort in a more subtle manner. He hadn't made any grand announcements about his ownership. He preferred to see how his staff, many of whom didn't even know him by face, handled their daily operations and, more importantly, how they treated their guests. Nathan adjusted the lapels of his tailored suit and started walking towards the grand entrance, his suitcase rolling quietly behind him. The resort, with its towering palm trees, lush gardens, and elegant marble columns, exuded an aura of wealth and exclusivity. Yet, as Nathan approached the front desk, a small flicker of anxiety crept into his chest. He had been in similar situations before. People often underestimated him based on his appearance, sometimes because of the way he dressed down, other times simply because of the color of his skin. The lobby was buzzing with activity. Guests lounged on the plush chairs, chatting and sipping drinks, while others milled about the concierge, gathering information about local attractions. Nathan approached the receptionist, a young woman with impeccably styled blonde hair and a sharp professional demeanor. She glanced up as Nathan neared, her eyes scanning him briefly before she offered a tight, polite smile. He noted the hesitation in her gaze, the flicker of discomfort that she quickly masked behind her customer service facade. Nathan smiled warmly. "Good afternoon. I'd like to check in. The reservation should be under Nathan Lewis." The receptionist blinked, her fingers pausing mid-typing on the keyboard. Her expression faltered for just a moment, but it was enough for Nathan to recognize what was happening. She glanced at him again, this time her gaze lingering, as if trying to piece together why a man like him would be standing in front of her, requesting a room at such an upscale establishment. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was laced with subtle uncertainty. Could you repeat the name?" she asked, her tone cautious. "Nathan Lewis," he said again, his voice calm but firm. She hesitated, her fingers tapping the keyboard slower than before. Nathan could tell that she wasn't just looking for the name. She was looking for something else, a reason perhaps, to confirm her assumptions. Her discomfort was palpable now, and though she tried to maintain professionalism, Nathan could see through the cracks in her demeanor. "I'm not finding it," she finally said, her voice tinged with what could only be described as skepticism. She looked up at him again, this time her gaze not as polite as before. "Are you sure it's under that name? Perhaps you're mistaken about the reservation." Nathan's patience didn't waver. He'd been through this before, too many times to count. Without raising his voice, he replied, "I'm certain. I made the reservation myself. Perhaps there's a mix-up with the system." The receptionist pursed her lips, her fingers hovering uncertainly over the keyboard. She stole another glance at him, as though his very presence in the luxurious surroundings didn't quite fit. It was subtle, but Nathan had seen this look countless times. It wasn't the overt racism that some might expect. It was quieter, more insidious. The kind that questioned his legitimacy without ever saying it out loud. It wasn't an accusation made directly, but rather one made through body language, hesitations, and careful avoidance. "I'll check again," she said, though her tone suggested she didn't think it was necessary. She barely glanced at the screen before shaking her head slightly. "No, I'm afraid there's no reservation under that name. Are you sure you have the right hotel?" Nathan's jaw tightened slightly, but he refused to let her see any frustration. "I'm sure," he said simply. There was a pause, an awkward silence hanging between them as the receptionist stared at her computer screen, pretending to be busy, perhaps hoping that Nathan would just give up and leave. But Nathan wasn't going anywhere. The receptionist finally looked up, her voice just a little firmer, more assertive. "I'm sorry, sir, but without a reservation, I can't check you in. Do you have a confirmation number or an email that I can check?" Nathan nodded. "I do. Let me pull it up for you." As Nathan reached for his phone to show the confirmation email, he could feel the eyes of other guests subtly drifting toward him. The bustling lobby had quieted a bit, as though people sensed the tension in the air. He could hear murmurs, perhaps speculation about why this black man was at the desk, being questioned about his stay at such an exclusive resort. He didn't need to turn around to know that some people were probably making assumptions. In moments like these, people often jumped to conclusions. As Nathan found the email, he handed the phone to the receptionist. She glanced at it, then back at him, still with that lingering sense of disbelief. She didn't immediately check the details. Instead, she hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line, as if unsure whether she should proceed. Nathan could almost hear her thoughts. Why would someone like him be staying here? I'll have to get my manager to look into this," she said, her voice a touch too high-pitched, betraying her discomfort. She quickly glanced over her shoulder, as if seeking rescue from the situation. Nathan remained calm, though inside he couldn't help but feel the familiar sting of indignity creeping up. He had every right to be here. He was the owner, after all. But watching this unfold, he knew that this interaction was about more than just a reservation. It was about perceptions, biases, and the assumptions that still followed him, despite his wealth and success. Moments later, the receptionist excused herself, rushing to the back to fetch the manager. Nathan stood by the counter, his phone still in hand, waiting, watching as the situation unfolded, just as he had expected it might. After what felt like an unusually long wait, Nathan saw the receptionist return, with a tall man striding confidently beside her. He was middle-aged, dressed in a sharp navy suit, with graying hair neatly combed back. His name tag, gleaming on his chest, read Mr. Thompson, and his expression already conveyed a certain air of authority and self-assuredness. Nathan could sense the shift in atmosphere as the receptionist, who had seemed unsure and uncomfortable earlier, now carried herself with a more pronounced sense of confidence, bolstered by the manager's presence. It was clear she had summoned him not just to resolve a reservation issue, but to confirm her suspicion that Nathan didn't belong here. As Mr. Thompson approached, his eyes flickered over Nathan briefly, the same calculating look that Nathan had seen many times before. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The pause, the judgment, the quiet moment where the manager seemed to size him up, as if trying to reconcile Nathan's presence with his own preconceived notions. The faint narrowing of his eyes revealed his doubt. In Mr. Thompson's world, Nathan did not fit the profile of a typical guest at Sunset Crest Resort. "Good afternoon, sir." Mr. Thompson greeted Nathan in a polite yet unmistakably condescending tone. He barely made eye contact, directing most of his attention to the receptionist who stood beside him, waiting for her explanation. The receptionist spoke quickly, her tone hushed, but audible enough for Nathan to catch every word. "This gentleman says he has a reservation under Nathan Lewis, but I can't seem to find it in our system," she explained. "He's asking if we could check again, but—" She trailed off, her sentence unfinished, the implication hanging in the air. The "but" was loaded with meaning. "But he doesn't seem like someone who would stay here. But I doubt this is a legitimate reservation." Mr. Thompson nodded, as though confirming her unspoken concerns, and then turned his full attention to Nathan. His polite smile never quite reached his eyes, and the way he squared his shoulders gave off an air of superiority. He was here to handle a situation, and clearly, in his mind, that situation was Nathan. "Mr. Lewis, is it?" he began, his voice smooth, but layered with thinly veiled skepticism. "I understand you're having trouble with your reservation." Nathan met his gaze evenly, nodding. "That's correct. I made the reservation a while ago, but it seems there's an issue finding it. I've shown the receptionist my confirmation email, so perhaps there's just a glitch in the system." Mr. Thompson's smile remained fixed in place, but his eyes betrayed his doubt. "I see," he said, though his tone suggested that he didn't believe Nathan at all. He made a show of glancing at the receptionist's computer screen, his fingers tapping lightly on the counter, though Nathan could tell he wasn't really looking for the reservation. Mr. Thompson's body language said it all. This wasn't about checking for a reservation. It was about proving a point. "Unfortunately," Mr. Thompson said after a moment, "I'm not seeing any record of a reservation under your name. Are you sure you booked with us? There are other hotels in the area. Perhaps there's been some confusion?" Nathan remained calm, though he could feel the subtle insult in the manager's words. There was no confusion. He knew exactly where he had booked, and he knew his reservation was legitimate. But Mr. Thompson's tone made it clear that he doubted that. The suggestion that Nathan might be confused about which hotel he had booked wasn't just a question. It was an assertion that Nathan didn't belong here. "I'm sure," Nathan replied, keeping his voice steady. "I'm happy to show you the confirmation email again. Everything is in order on my end." Mr. Thompson gave a slight, almost dismissive nod, as though humoring Nathan. "Of course," he said, but there was no genuine belief in his words. "Please, let me see the email." Nathan handed him his phone, the confirmation email clearly displayed on the screen. Mr. Thompson took the phone with the same practiced politeness, his eyes briefly scanning the screen. But as Nathan watched, it was obvious that the manager wasn't truly reviewing the information. He glanced over it, barely taking in the details, before handing the phone back to Nathan with a small, tight smile. "It's possible that there's been a mix-up," Mr. Thompson said, his tone now shifting to one of finality, as though he had already decided that the conversation was over. "Unfortunately, without a reservation in our system, there's not much we can do. I'd recommend checking with the third-party service you may have booked through. Sometimes there are discrepancies." Nathan's patience was being tested now. He had dealt with similar situations before, but what made this moment sting was the fact that he owned this hotel. The audacity of being told to check with a third-party service when he had personally made the arrangements was a sharp reminder of how, even at the peak of his success, people could still doubt him based solely on their perceptions. "I didn't book through a third party," Nathan said, maintaining his calm. "This was a direct booking with the hotel. I have the confirmation number, and I know my reservation exists. Perhaps you can try another system?" Mr. Thompson's smile faltered just a bit, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. His polite facade was cracking. He wasn't used to being challenged in this way, especially by someone he had already mentally dismissed as unworthy of his time. The manager straightened up, his voice cooling as he replied, "Sir, I'm trying to be as helpful as possible, but we simply don't have any record of your stay. If you'd like, I can assist you in finding alternative accommodations, but beyond that, Nathan didn't let him finish. "I don't need alternative accommodations," he said, his tone now carrying more weight. "I need you to find my reservation." There was a moment of tense silence. The receptionist, who had been standing quietly to the side, exchanged a nervous glance with Mr. Thompson. It was clear she hadn't expected Nathan to push back like this. Guests like him, guests they made assumptions about, usually backed down when faced with this kind of resistance. But Nathan wasn't backing down. Mr. Thompson's polite smile was now more of a grimace. "I'm going to have to ask for further proof of your reservation," he said, his voice firming. "If you can't provide it, I'm afraid we'll have to ask you to leave the premises." Nathan's eyebrows raised slightly. "Are you saying that without further proof, you'll remove me from the hotel?" Mr. Thompson's gaze hardened. "I'm saying that if we can't verify your stay, you won't be allowed to remain on the property." There it was, the underlying threat. Nathan could hear it clearly now. He wasn't being treated as a guest with an issue. He was being treated as an intruder, someone whose presence was not only questioned, but actively unwelcome. Nathan inhaled slowly, keeping his voice level. "I've already provided you with the confirmation. I'm more than willing to cooperate, but if you're unable to resolve this, then I'll have to speak with someone higher up." Mr. Thompson's smile dropped entirely now, his expression hardening into one of frustration. "Sir, I am the general manager here. There's no one higher you can speak to. Now, if you don't have any further proof, I'll have no choice but to ask you to leave." The words hung in the air, like a gauntlet thrown down. Mr. Thompson's authority, his perceived power, was being challenged, and he was no longer trying to hide his disdain. In his eyes, Nathan was nothing more than a problem to be dealt with, a guest whose presence wasn't worth the hassle. And in his mind, the solution was clear: remove him. Nathan, however, wasn't going to be removed. He met Mr. Thompson's gaze, his calm exterior masking the anger simmering just below the surface. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down, not just on him, but on the countless others who had faced similar prejudice. And in this moment, Nathan knew that revealing his true identity would turn this entire encounter upside down. But not yet. He wasn't finished watching them dig their own graves. The tension in the lobby was palpable now. Nathan could feel the eyes of other guests and staff subtly shifting toward him, drawn by the escalating conversation. Mr. Thompson, his patience visibly fraying, had reached the end of his civility. He stood straighter, the polite mask completely gone, and motioned toward one of the security personnel who had been standing near the entrance. The security guard, a tall man with a muscular build, began to approach with a purpose, his eyes flicking between Nathan and Mr. Thompson, as though waiting for a signal. Nathan remained calm, his hands at his sides, watching the scene unfold as if from a distance. He knew exactly what was happening. The moment was all too familiar. The escalation from polite skepticism to outright dismissal, where logic and reason no longer mattered. He could have revealed who he was in an instant, stopped this ridiculous charade with a single sentence. But Nathan wanted to see how far they would go. He wanted to see just how deep their prejudice ran, how much they would cling to their assumptions before realizing the truth. Mr. Thompson turned to the security guard, his voice cold and authoritative. "Please escort this gentleman off the property. He doesn't have a valid reservation, and we need to ensure that our guests aren't disturbed." The guard nodded without hesitation, stepping up to Nathan, who remained unmoving, his gaze locked with Mr. Thompson's. There was a flicker of something in Mr. Thompson's eyes. Victory, perhaps. He had won, at least in his mind. He had exercised his authority, and Nathan was now just another unwanted guest being removed. The manager didn't care about the details anymore. He didn't care that Nathan had provided a confirmation number, or that the system might be flawed. All that mattered to him was that Nathan didn't fit his idea of who belonged in a place like this. The security guard, towering over Nathan, spoke in a firm, no-nonsense tone. "Sir, we're going to have to ask you to leave. If you don't cooperate, we'll have to remove you by force." Nathan's jaw tightened, though he kept his voice steady. "I've done nothing wrong. I've shown my reservation confirmation, and I'm a guest here. If there's an issue, it's with your system, not with me." The guard didn't flinch. He had a job to do, and clearly he had received his orders. "Sir, I understand, but we've been instructed to remove you from the premises. Please don't make this more difficult than it has to be." A small crowd was beginning to gather now. Guests, some in swimsuits and robes, others dressed for business meetings or dinners, paused in the lobby, drawn by the unfolding drama. Nathan could hear the whispers, the murmurs of speculation. What's going on? Why is security involved? Did he do something? The questions floated through the air like smoke, fueling the unspoken narrative that Nathan had somehow caused this situation. He could see it in their eyes, the quiet judgments being formed without a shred of evidence. Nathan turned back to Mr. Thompson, who stood with his arms crossed, watching with a cool detachment. There was no sympathy, no desire to resolve the situation peacefully. To Mr. Thompson, this was just another problem being efficiently handled by his team. "You're really going to go through with this?" Nathan asked, his voice low, but charged with an intensity that Mr. Thompson seemed to ignore. The manager's expression didn't change. "I'm afraid you've left us no choice, sir. If you refuse to leave on your own, we will remove you. Sunset Crest Resort has a reputation to maintain, and we can't allow disruptions to our other guests." Nathan almost laughed at the absurdity of the statement. A reputation to maintain. And what exactly did Mr. Thompson think would happen when it became clear who Nathan really was? He could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him, not just as an individual, but as a symbol. He knew that his removal wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever been judged, dismissed, or removed because of the color of their skin, or the assumptions others made about them. The security guard stepped closer now, his body language making it clear that he was prepared to act. "Sir, please cooperate. We don't want this to escalate." Nathan took a deep breath, deciding to let the moment play out a little longer. He knew the power he held, but he wanted them to feel the full weight of their actions before he dropped the inevitable bombshell. "I'll leave," Nathan said quietly, his voice carrying across the lobby. "But let me be clear. This is going to be a mistake you'll regret." Mr. Thompson's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smirk, as though he was accustomed to hearing empty threats from guests who had been denied service. He didn't know, of course, that this time the threat was very real. The security guard gestured toward the door, and Nathan turned, walking slowly toward the exit. He felt the stares burning into his back, the collective judgment of the guests and staff alike. He was being escorted out like a criminal, as though his mere presence was a disruption to the order of things. Nathan didn't raise his voice, didn't cause a scene. He let the situation play out exactly as they wanted it to, knowing full well that the story wasn't over. As he walked through the wide glass doors of the lobby out into the sunny afternoon, a voice called out behind him. A guest who had been watching from the sidelines had pulled out their phone, recording the entire exchange. "Hey man, you okay? That was messed up," the person said, clearly appalled by what they had witnessed. "I got the whole thing on video." Nathan gave the person a nod, appreciating the gesture, but knowing that he didn't need anyone else's validation. The video would be useful, of course, but it wasn't essential. What mattered now was how the next part of the story would unfold. He walked calmly toward his car, the security guard lingering just inside the entrance to ensure he left the premises. The murmurs from the crowd inside grew louder as Nathan disappeared from view, leaving behind the unsettled buzz of a situation that no one quite understood yet. As he slid into the driver's seat, Nathan took one last glance at the resort's grand facade. Sunset Crest Resort, his resort. And they had just thrown him out. He could almost hear the ticking of the clock in his mind, counting down the moments until the truth would come crashing down on them like a tidal wave. He smiled to himself, knowing that when he returned, the very people who had doubted him, dismissed him, and forced him out would be the ones scrambling to save their jobs. The irony wasn't lost on him. In the end, it wouldn't be Nathan who lost out. It would be them. As Nathan drove away from the resort, his mind was calm, though his thoughts moved quickly. The weight of the situation hung in the air like a storm cloud. But Nathan knew that this was no ordinary confrontation. The humiliation he had just endured wasn't going to be another fleeting moment of racial prejudice that was swept under the rug. Not this time. He was already planning his next move, even as the resort's imposing structure faded into the distance behind him. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat beside him, lighting up with notifications. The moment he had stepped out of the resort, the video that had been captured by the bystander had begun to make its rounds online. In an age where nothing stayed private for long, the recording had been uploaded to social media, and it was already gaining traction. The video, showing Nathan being calmly but forcefully escorted out of the Sunset Crest Resort, was spreading fast. Comments, shares, and likes were piling up by the second, and as more people watched, the story was quickly being picked up by bloggers and social media influencers. Nathan glanced at his phone briefly at a red light, his notifications buzzing nonstop. There were already thousands of views and retweets. The caption attached to the video read, "This man was kicked out of a luxury hotel for not belonging, despite having a reservation. Is this 2024 or 1950? The reaction from the online community was immediate and fierce. People were outraged by the blatant discrimination, calling for accountability, for boycotts, for action. Nathan could see the tide turning in real time, and the hotel didn't even know yet what was coming. He wasn't surprised. He had seen it before. How quickly social media could become a battleground for issues like these. What started as a simple video would soon ignite into a firestorm of public backlash. And the more the story spread, the more pressure the hotel would face. The general public had no tolerance for blatant discrimination, especially in high-end, supposedly progressive establishments like Sunset Crest Resort. By the time Nathan pulled into the driveway of his home, the video had gone viral. News outlets had picked up the story. Headlines flashed across his phone screen. "Black man removed from luxury resort, despite valid reservation." Sunset Crest Resort faces backlash after racially charged incident. Is this the face of hospitality in 2024? Nathan leaned back in his seat, allowing himself a moment to breathe. He knew what was coming next. The PR team at the resort, assuming they even noticed what was happening yet, would scramble to contain the damage. But it was already too late. The internet was a wildfire that no press release could fully extinguish. especially when it came to issues of race and discrimination. His phone buzzed again, this time with a call from his lawyer and longtime business associate, Jamie. Nathan picked up immediately, already knowing what the call was about. "You see it yet?" Jamie's voice came through, sharp and focused, though there was an undertone of disbelief. "The video's everywhere, man. People are going crazy. You okay?" Nathan smiled slightly, appreciating Jamie's concern. "I'm fine," he replied. "I knew something like this might happen. I just didn't think they'd go this far. They've got no idea who I am." Jamie exhaled audibly. "Well, they're about to find out. What's the plan? Are we going public with your ownership now, or do we let this play out a little longer?" Nathan paused, considering his next move carefully. "Not yet. Let them sweat for a bit. The longer they go without realizing, the worse it'll be for them. I want them to feel the pressure before we make any announcements. This isn't just about me. It's about making sure this never happens again, to anyone." Jamie agreed. "Good call. But we should move quickly. You know they'll issue some generic apology soon, trying to smooth it over. Once they do that, we'll have the leverage we need." Nathan nodded, even though Jamie couldn't see him. "I'll handle it. Just keep an eye on the news and prepare the paperwork. We'll make our move when the time's right." After hanging up, Nathan sat quietly for a few moments, reflecting on everything that had transpired. Despite the public outrage swirling around him, he felt no rush, no urgency to act immediately. Timing was everything. The resort would soon face more than just an angry internet mob. They would be facing their own failure to recognize not just their own bias, but the consequences of that bias. Hours later, as the sun began to set, Nathan's phone chimed with an alert. As expected, Sunset Crest Resort had issued an official statement. It was the typical corporate apology, carefully crafted to deflect blame, while addressing the situation as vaguely as possible. The statement read, "We deeply regret any distress caused by today's incident and are reviewing our policies to ensure that all of our guests are treated with the utmost respect. We are conducting a thorough internal investigation to address the concerns raised by the video circulating online. We do not tolerate discrimination of any kind and are committed to maintaining a welcoming environment for all guests." Nathan scoffed, shaking his head. It was the same generic response he had seen countless times from companies facing backlash. There was no acknowledgement of the systemic issues at play, no real accountability, just empty words meant to pacify the public. But the public wasn't buying it. As he scrolled through the comments on the resort's official statement, Nathan could see that people weren't letting it slide. The internet had become a courtroom of sorts, with users condemning the resort's actions and pointing out the emptiness of their apology. Influencers, activists, and even a few celebrities had started to weigh in, amplifying the outrage. One tweet in particular stood out. "Apologies mean nothing when the damage is already done. Sunset Crest Resort needs to do more than just review policies. They need to make real changes. #do better." Nathan couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The world was watching now, and the pressure was mounting. The hotel's reputation was in freefall, and they didn't even know the half of it. As the resort's statement continued to trend for all the wrong reasons, Nathan knew that it was time to move forward with the next phase of his plan. The following morning, Nathan made a few calls to his team. Everything was set in motion now. He had acquired the majority stake in Sunset Crest Resort months ago, but he had chosen to remain in the background, letting the hotel's existing management continue running the day-to-day operations. He had wanted to observe, to see how the resort functioned without interference. before he made any significant changes. But now, after the events of the past 24 hours, it was clear that a complete overhaul was necessary. He had his legal team prepare a formal announcement of his ownership, along with a press release detailing the upcoming changes he planned to implement at the resort. It was time for the staff, especially Mr. Thompson and the receptionist, to learn the truth. By midday, the official press release was ready. Nathan reviewed the statement carefully before giving his approval. The announcement was concise but powerful, outlining his position as the new majority owner of Sunset Crest Resort. The press release emphasized his commitment to creating a more inclusive, welcoming environment for all guests and employees, and it promised immediate action to address the issues exposed by the recent incident. There would be new policies, new training, and a complete restructuring of the management team. As soon as the press release went live, the internet exploded again. News outlets that had covered the viral video quickly updated their stories, now featuring headlines like, "Man kicked out of resort revealed to be the new owner." Sunset Crest faces massive shakeup as owner. Steps forward. And new resort owner Nathan Lewis promises change after incident. The public response was swift and dramatic. People who had previously condemned the resort now expressed hope that real change would come under Nathan's leadership. Social media lit up with messages of support for Nathan, with many praising him for his calm and calculated response to the situation. Others marveled at the irony of the hotel staff kicking out their own boss without realizing it. As the day wore on, the staff at Sunset Crest Resort would finally learn what they had done, and Nathan was ready to return to the place that had so callously dismissed him, not as an unwanted guest, but as the rightful owner. The real transformation was about to begin. The morning sun cast a golden hue over the Sunset Crest Resort as Nathan Lewis arrived once again, this time not as a guest, but as the rightful owner. The sprawling grounds were as pristine as ever, with manicured lawns stretching out towards the shimmering coastline and the distant hum of the ocean in the background. Guests were already strolling along the pathways, some with coffee in hand, others preparing for a day of leisure. The scene was idyllic, yet beneath the surface, a storm was brewing, and Nathan was about to unleash it. He parked his car in the reserved spot that bore no name. But today, everyone would soon know exactly who that spot was meant for. Stepping out, he straightened his suit, a dark, sleek ensemble that projected authority and confidence. His heart was steady, his mind clear. He had played this scenario over in his head a dozen times, knowing precisely what needed to be done. As he entered the resort, the atmosphere inside was markedly different from the last time he had been here. The staff moved about with their usual precision, unaware of the significance of the day. The same receptionist from the previous incident stood behind the front desk, her posture as rigid as ever, typing away on her keyboard. She didn't notice Nathan at first, her focus on the computer, processing the reservations for the day's guests. Nathan approached the desk calmly, his presence immediately causing her to glance up. For a moment, her eyes locked with his, and a flicker of recognition passed across her face. She hesitated, as if recalling the uncomfortable exchange from the previous day. Her lips parted, and she opened her mouth to speak, but the words seemed to falter. Nathan said nothing. He only waited. Before the receptionist could gather herself, Mr. Thompson emerged from his office, his walk as brisk and purposeful as ever. His appearance was as sharp as the day before. Immaculate suit, neatly combed hair, the air of authority that he seemed to wear like armor. He didn't immediately notice Nathan standing at the counter. Instead, he turned to speak with a member of the staff, issuing instructions about the day's schedule. But then his gaze shifted, and his expression changed. He saw Nathan standing there, the man he had unceremoniously dismissed not 24 hours ago. Mr. Thompson's eyes narrowed slightly, his confusion apparent. For a brief second, he seemed to wonder why this man had returned, though his professional demeanor quickly took over, masking any trace of uncertainty. "Can I help you?" Mr. Thompson asked, his voice formal, but lacking the condescending tone it had carried the previous day. Perhaps he sensed something different in Nathan's bearing this time, an authority that wasn't there before. But he still didn't recognize the reality of the situation. Nathan stood there, allowing the silence to stretch out just long enough to make Mr. Thompson uncomfortable. He could see the man's mind working, trying to figure out why this guest, who had been escorted off the premises, would dare to return. But Nathan didn't give him the answer immediately. He let Mr. Thompson flounder, even if just for a moment, before speaking. "I'm here for a meeting," Nathan said, his voice steady, his eyes never leaving Mr. Thompson's. There was no hint of the previous day's tension in his voice, only calm control. Mr. Thompson straightened, his confusion deepening. "A meeting? I don't believe we have you scheduled for any meetings today," he replied, glancing down at his clipboard, as though confirming his statement. Nathan smiled slightly, the kind of smile that carried weight, a smile that told Mr. Thompson he was about to learn something he wasn't prepared for. "I think you'll find that I do have a meeting," Nathan said, his voice soft but authoritative. "It's with the entire staff." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with significance. Mr. Thompson blinked, taken aback. He glanced at the receptionist, who stood frozen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, as if she didn't know what to do next. Slowly, realization began to dawn on Mr. Thompson's face, though he still didn't fully grasp the gravity of the situation. "What do you mean, a meeting with the staff?" Mr. Thompson asked, a note of unease creeping into his voice. Nathan took a step closer, his posture calm but commanding. "I'm the new majority owner of this resort," he said simply, letting the weight of the statement settle in. Mr. Thompson's face drained of color. For a moment, he seemed to be processing what Nathan had just said, as though his brain couldn't quite catch up with the reality. The man he had kicked out, the man he had dismissed without a second thought, was now standing before him as his boss. The shift in power was instantaneous, and Mr. Thompson's entire demeanor faltered. I'm sorry," Mr. Thompson stammered, his professional facade crumbling. "You're the owner?" Nathan didn't need to repeat himself. He could see the realization fully dawning on Mr. Thompson now, the shock sinking in. The man's eyes widened, his body language shifting from one of authority to one of vulnerability. The power he had wielded so carelessly yesterday was gone, and in its place, there was nothing but regret. "I tried to tell you yesterday," Nathan said evenly, "but you were too quick to judge. Too quick to dismiss me." The receptionist stood in stunned silence, her face pale, clearly realizing the magnitude of the situation as well. She glanced nervously between Nathan and Mr. Thompson, as if she were afraid of what was coming next. Nathan turned his gaze to her for a moment, but he said nothing. The message was clear without words. There was a long, uncomfortable pause as Mr. Thompson tried to regain his composure. "Mr. Lewis, we had no idea. I didn't know." His words were jumbled, an awkward attempt at an apology. "I deeply regret the misunderstanding from yesterday. Please, let me explain." Nathan held up his hand, silencing Mr. Thompson mid-sentence. "There's no need to explain," he said, his voice firm but calm. The only thing that matters now is what happens next. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. The resort, which had seemed so serene and orderly moments ago, now felt like a house of cards, ready to collapse under the weight of the truth. Nathan could see the fear in Mr. Thompson's eyes, the desperate scramble for damage control. But Nathan wasn't interested in excuses. This wasn't about one incident. It was about a culture that needed to be dismantled. "I'm calling a staff meeting," Nathan continued. "Immediately. Everyone needs to be there. There are going to be changes, and I want every employee present." Mr. Thompson, still visibly shaken, nodded rapidly. Of course, he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I'll have everyone gathered in the main conference room right away." Nathan didn't need to say anything more. He turned and began walking toward the conference room, his presence commanding the attention of everyone around him. As he moved through the lobby, staff members and guests alike looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. The atmosphere was electric, charged with the knowledge that something big was about to happen. Mr. Thompson scrambled to follow, barking orders at the staff to gather everyone as quickly as possible. The receptionist hurried off to alert the rest of the team, her expression one of barely contained panic. The resort, which had operated so smoothly on the surface, was now in a state of quiet chaos. Nathan entered the large conference room at the back of the resort, the space normally reserved for high-end business meetings and exclusive events. Today, it would serve as the place where everything changed. As staff members began to trickle in, there was a palpable sense of unease. The employees, still unaware of the full situation, could feel the tension in the air. They exchanged nervous glances as they took their seats, waiting for whatever was about to unfold. Within minutes, the room was filled. Nathan stood at the front, his eyes scanning the crowd. He recognized many of the faces from his visits to the resort in the past, though most had never given him more than a passing glance. Now, they were all looking at him with the same expression: confusion, curiosity, and, for some, fear. Mr. Thompson stood off to the side, visibly anxious, his hands wringing together as he waited for Nathan to speak. The man who had once been so confident, so certain of his place at the top of the hierarchy, now looked small and uncertain. Nathan cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice calm but commanding. "I'm Nathan Lewis, and as of several months ago, I became the majority owner of Sunset Crest Resort." The ripple of shock that passed through the room was immediate. Murmurs of disbelief spread among the staff, eyes widening as they realized the significance of what Nathan was saying. Some exchanged incredulous glances, while others simply stared, unsure of how to react. "I've spent time observing how this resort operates," Nathan continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. "And I've seen both the good and the bad. Yesterday, I experienced firsthand what happens when assumptions and prejudices take precedence over professionalism and respect." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. He didn't need to point fingers. Everyone knew what he was referring to. Mr. Thompson shifted uncomfortably beside him, his face pale as the weight of his actions pressed down on him. "But this isn't just about one incident," Nathan said, his voice growing firmer. "This is about creating a culture of respect and equality, not just for our guests, but for every employee who works here. Moving forward, things are going to change. Effective immediately, we will be implementing new policies to ensure that this resort reflects the values of inclusivity, professionalism, and fairness." The room remained silent, but Nathan could see the impact his words were having. The staff was listening, truly listening, and for the first time in a long while, there was a sense that things might actually change. The room was filled with an almost oppressive silence as Nathan's words continued to echo through the minds of the staff. They sat motionless, absorbing the gravity of what had just been revealed. Some looked shocked, others visibly uncomfortable. But one thing was certain. Every single person in that room now knew that the power dynamic had shifted completely. This was no longer just another staff meeting. This was a reckoning. Nathan stood at the front, his calm yet commanding presence radiating authority. His posture was relaxed, but his expression was focused, showing that he had no intention of letting anyone off easily. He glanced briefly at Mr. Thompson, whose once confident facade had all but crumbled. The hotel manager now stood to the side, hands nervously clasped in front of him, his eyes darting around the room, looking for anything to ground himself in this rapidly changing reality. Nathan allowed the weight of the moment to settle before he spoke again. I called this meeting because there are fundamental changes that need to happen here. Changes that should have been made a long time ago. What happened yesterday was more than just a mistake. It was a symptom of a much larger problem. A problem rooted in assumptions, in prejudice, and in a culture that has gone unchecked for far too long. The staff remained quiet, many looking down at their hands or shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Nathan knew that some of them had been complicit in the behavior that led to his being kicked out, while others might have been bystanders, watching, but saying nothing. Regardless, they were all now part of a system that was about to be dismantled, whether they liked it or not. Nathan continued, his tone measured but firm. This resort has built its reputation on luxury and exclusivity. But let me make one thing clear. Exclusivity does not mean exclusion. Moving forward, Sunset Crest will be a place where every guest is treated with respect, regardless of how they look, where they come from, or how much money they have. And that respect will extend to every single employee as well. His words seemed to hang in the air, a direct challenge to the old way of thinking that had permeated the resort for so long. He knew that changing a culture like this wasn't going to happen overnight. But he also knew that it had to start with clear, uncompromising steps. And that began with addressing the individuals most responsible for maintaining the old order. Nathan turned slightly, his gaze settling on Mr. Thompson. The manager visibly stiffened under Nathan's gaze, as if anticipating what was coming next. The staff, sensing the shift in focus, glanced nervously at their superior. Everyone knew that Mr. Thompson had been at the heart of the previous day's incident. His condescending attitude and blatant dismissal of Nathan's rightful place as a guest had sparked the entire debacle. And now, standing in front of the man he had wronged, he could no longer hide behind his title or authority. Mr. Thompson, Nathan said, his voice cutting through the silence. Yesterday, you made several assumptions about me. You didn't listen when I told you I had a reservation. You dismissed my concerns and chose to escalate the situation instead of resolving it professionally. Your actions were not just a reflection of poor management. They were a reflection of a deeper bias that has no place in this resort. The color drained from Mr. Thompson's face. His mouth opened slightly as though he was about to offer a defense, but he seemed to think better of it. There was no defense to offer, no excuse that could justify what had happened. He was now standing in front of not only the staff he once commanded, but the man who now held all the power. I want to be clear, Nathan continued, that this isn't just about yesterday. This is about the culture you've allowed to thrive under your leadership. A culture of arrogance, exclusion, and entitlement. As of today, You are no longer the manager of Sunset Crest Resort." The room collectively inhaled, the shock of Nathan's words settling like a heavy fog over everyone present. Mr. Thompson's eyes widened in disbelief, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. He looked around as if hoping to find someone who might come to his defense, but all he found were the faces of his staff, many of whom were avoiding his gaze entirely. "Mr. Lewis," Thompson stammered, I assure you, this was a misunderstanding. I didn't mean for it to escalate." "It's not just about you, Mr. Thompson," Nathan interrupted calmly. "It's about the environment that has been cultivated here. The dismissiveness, the discrimination, the lack of accountability. It stops today. And that means making sure the people in charge are held responsible for their actions." Mr. Thompson opened his mouth again, as if to protest further, but Nathan raised a hand, silencing him once more. There was nothing left to say. His dismissal had been finalized the moment he had allowed his own biases to cloud his judgment, and now he was facing the consequences. "You will be escorted off the premises," Nathan said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Effective immediately." There was a moment of stunned silence before Mr. Thompson, realizing that his time had come, nodded stiffly. His pride clearly wounded, he turned on his heel and walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet room. Two security guards, who had undoubtedly been briefed about the situation, stepped forward, ready to accompany him out of the building. It was a humiliating end for a man who had once wielded so much authority here. But Nathan knew it was necessary. The message had to be clear. No one was above accountability. As the door closed behind Mr. Thompson, the staff seemed to collectively exhale, the tension in the room breaking slightly. But Nathan wasn't finished. "There are others who have played a role in maintaining this toxic culture," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "You know who you are, and if you think this is where the changes stop, you're mistaken. We will be reviewing every level of management, every department, to ensure that these values, equality, respect, and professionalism, are upheld at all times." The staff exchanged uneasy glances, some clearly worried about their future at the resort. Nathan could see the anxiety in their faces, the uncertainty that came with such a dramatic upheaval. But he wasn't interested in simply instilling fear. He wanted to offer them an opportunity for real growth. "Let me be clear," Nathan said, softening his tone just slightly. "This is a chance for all of you to step up. If you're willing to embrace these changes, to help create an environment that is welcoming to everyone, then you have a place here. But if you resist, if you continue to hold on to old prejudices and assumptions, you will find yourself without a job. It's as simple as that." The room was silent again, the weight of Nathan's words sinking in. There were some faces in the crowd who seemed relieved, grateful even, for the changes he was promising. Others, however, looked unsure, caught between their loyalty to the old ways and the fear of losing their jobs. "From this point forward," Nathan said, "we will be implementing mandatory training for all staff on cultural sensitivity, diversity, and inclusion. These trainings will not be optional, and they will be ongoing. The goal here is not just to check a box, but to create lasting change, to ensure that every guest who walks through these doors feels respected and valued." A murmur of acknowledgement rippled through the crowd. Nathan knew that for some, this would be a difficult transition. Old habits, especially those rooted in deep-seated prejudices, die hard. But he was committed to seeing it through. He wasn't just here to clean up after one incident. He was here to transform the entire culture of the resort, to turn it into a place that reflected his values and vision. Nathan took a deep breath and looked out at the staff. seeing them not as obstacles, but as people who could help bring about that change, if they were willing. "This resort has the potential to be something truly special," he said. "But it starts with all of you. The decisions you make every day, how you treat each other, how you treat our guests. That's what will define Sunset Crest moving forward. This is your chance to be part of something better." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. Then he added, "You all have a choice. You can either be part of the solution, or you can be part of the past." The silence that followed was different now, not the tense, uncomfortable silence from earlier, but a more thoughtful, contemplative one. The staff was processing everything they had just heard, weighing their options, considering their futures. And Nathan could see that for many of them, the path forward was becoming clear. "Now," Nathan said, his tone shifting slightly, "let's get to work." As the meeting came to an end and the staff began to file out of the conference room, there was an undercurrent of tension, but also a sense of something new brewing. Change, yes, but not just any change. It was a profound shift, one that would reshape the foundation of Sunset Crest Resort. The staff walked slowly, murmuring to one another in hushed voices, still absorbing the weight of Nathan's words. Some looked uneasy, others pensive, and a few even seemed relieved, as though the new direction had sparked a glimmer of hope they hadn't expected. Nathan stayed behind for a few moments, watching them leave. He knew that many of the staff members would find this transition challenging. Resistance was inevitable. People didn't give up old ways easily, especially when those ways had been ingrained in the very culture of the place. But Nathan wasn't here to enforce change with an iron fist. He believed that transformation came from within, from reshaping the mindset of those willing to learn and grow. Those who resisted would ultimately be weeded out, not by force, but by their own unwillingness to adapt. As he left the conference room and stepped back into the bustling resort, Nathan noticed subtle differences in the way people interacted with him now. The once dismissive glances he had received, the looks of doubt and judgment that had accompanied his every move the day before, were gone. The staff now looked at him with a mixture of respect and apprehension. He wasn't just a guest anymore. He was the owner, and that changed everything. Nathan's first order of business was to meet with the leadership team, those still in charge of the various departments who hadn't been swept away with Mr. Thompson's departure. The hotel's management structure was deeply embedded in the old ways of thinking, and Nathan knew that if real change was to happen, it had to start from the top. He called a private meeting with the department heads later that afternoon, gathering them in the executive suite, which overlooked the stunning coastline. As they entered the room, the tension was palpable. Each manager carried a different expression. Some were guarded, others eager to prove themselves. A few, Nathan could tell, were there out of sheer obligation, clearly uneasy about the changes he was planning to implement. Nathan stood at the window for a moment, gazing out at the sparkling ocean, before turning to face the group. The luxury and beauty of the resort were undeniable, but he could see through the veneer now. Beneath the polished surface lay a culture that needed to be dismantled. He could feel the weight of the task before him, but it only fueled his determination. "Thank you all for coming," Nathan began, his voice calm, but with a tone of authority that demanded attention. "I know the last 24 hours have been a whirlwind for many of you, but we have work to do. As I said earlier today, Sunset Crest Resort is entering a new chapter. The leadership team is going to be at the forefront of this transformation." He paused, letting his words sink in. The managers sat in a semicircle, their faces a mix of anticipation and caution. He knew some of them had been close with Mr. Thompson and were likely wondering how their positions would be affected by his dismissal. Nathan didn't want to keep them in suspense for long. I'm aware that some of you have been here for many years, and I appreciate the experience and commitment you bring to this resort. Nathan continued, acknowledging their tenure. But experience alone won't be enough moving forward. What we need is a commitment to the new values this resort will uphold: equality, respect, and inclusion. These are non-negotiable. If you're willing to embrace these values and lead by example, you'll have a place here. But if you can't, if you're not willing to adapt, then you need to step aside. The air in the room grew thicker, the tension nearly tangible. Nathan could see a few of the managers shifting in their seats, clearly uncomfortable with the ultimatum he had just laid out. One of them, a middle-aged man named Mark, who had been head of the guest services department for over a decade, cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly. "With all due respect, Mr. Lewis," Mark began, choosing his words carefully. "Many of us have been working at this resort for years, and we've maintained the high standards that have made Sunset Crest one of the most prestigious destinations in the region. I'm not saying we don't need to change, but some of us feel like this shift is happening very quickly. Are you sure this kind of overhaul is necessary?" Nathan looked directly at Mark, appreciating the fact that he had spoken up rather than staying silent. This was exactly the kind of dialogue Nathan wanted: open, honest, and not cloaked in passive resistance. He took a moment before responding. "I understand your concern," Nathan said, his tone respectful but firm, "and I respect the work you've done to maintain those high standards. But here's the thing. Those high standards don't mean much if they're built on a foundation of exclusion. Yes, this resort has thrived financially and aesthetically, but the culture beneath that success has been toxic for far too long. It's not just about maintaining prestige. It's about creating an environment where everyone, guests and employees alike, feels valued and respected." Nathan paused to let the words sink in before continuing. "What happened yesterday, and what I've witnessed over the past few months, is indicative of a larger issue. An issue that has allowed bias to infiltrate every level of this resort. That kind of culture doesn't just happen overnight. It grows because it's tolerated, because people in leadership positions don't challenge it. I'm asking you, as the leaders of this resort, to help me root it out. That's why this change is happening so quickly, because it has to." The room remained silent for a moment, the weight of Nathan's words settling heavily on the group. Mark nodded slightly, his expression thoughtful, as if processing the depth of the challenge ahead. He wasn't fully on board yet. Nathan could see that. But he wasn't outright rejecting the changes either. Nathan continued, "Let me be clear. This isn't about punishment. It's about growth. It's about making sure this resort represents the best of what we can offer, not just in terms of luxury, but in terms of humanity. We have the opportunity to set a new standard for what it means to be an inclusive, world-class destination. But it has to start here, with the leadership." He let the room sit in silence for a moment before speaking again. "I'll be working closely with each of you to ensure that these values are implemented at every level. You'll have the resources, the training, and the support you need to make this transition. But if I sense resistance, if I feel that anyone is holding on to the old ways of thinking, there won't be room for them here." Nathan's tone was calm, but there was no mistaking the firmness behind his words. He knew that not everyone in that room would make it through the transition, but he was prepared for that. What mattered now was that the leadership set the tone for the rest of the staff. After the meeting, Nathan stayed behind to speak with a few of the managers who had approached him privately, expressing their willingness to embrace the changes and asking for guidance on how they could better align with the new vision for the resort. It was a small but significant step, proof that some were ready to move forward, even if the process would be uncomfortable. Over the next few weeks, the resort began to undergo its transformation. The cultural sensitivity and diversity training programs Nathan had promised were rolled out across all departments. These weren't just token seminars. They were in-depth workshops designed to confront the biases and assumptions that had gone unchecked for so long. Trainers were brought in from respected organizations, and the sessions were mandatory for every employee, from the housekeeping staff to the top-tier management. Nathan attended many of the sessions himself, not as a spectator, but as an active participant. He wanted his presence to send a clear message. He wasn't just an absentee owner, making demands from behind the scenes. He was deeply invested in the changes he was implementing, and he expected the same level of commitment from everyone else. During one of the sessions, the receptionist who had played a central role in the incident that sparked everything approached Nathan during a break. She looked nervous, her eyes darting around as if unsure whether she should even be speaking to him. "Mr. Lewis," she began hesitantly, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I know I didn't handle things the right way the other day, and I've been thinking a lot about what you said. I realize now that I was making assumptions I shouldn't have made." Nathan looked at her for a moment, taking in her sincerity. He could see that this wasn't just an apology for the sake of appearances. There was genuine reflection in her words. "I appreciate that," Nathan said calmly. "It's not easy to confront those kinds of biases, but acknowledging them is the first step toward change. What matters now is what you do moving forward." She nodded, relief washing over her face. "I'll do better," she said, her voice stronger now. "I want to be part of this new chapter." Nathan smiled, a small but genuine smile. "That's all I ask." As the days passed, it became clear that the changes were starting to take root. The once rigid and exclusive atmosphere of Sunset Crest began to soften. New staff members were hired from more diverse backgrounds, bringing fresh perspectives and ideas to the resort. Guests who had once felt uncomfortable or out of place now found themselves welcomed with open arms. Nathan knew there would still be challenges ahead. Some staff members had quietly left, unable or unwilling to adapt to the new culture. Others stayed but grumbled under their breath about the new direction. But for every person who resisted, there were two more who embraced the changes, eager to be part of something bigger than themselves. The transformation of Sunset Crest wasn't just about saving a business. It was about redefining what success looked like. For Nathan, it was about building a legacy, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. And as the resort thrived under its new leadership, Nathan knew that the real success wasn't in the numbers or the accolades. It was in the people, the staff and the guests, who now walked through the doors knowing that this place, this luxury resort, was a reflection of the very best of what humanity could be when it chose inclusion over exclusion, respect over prejudice. This was the Sunset Crest Nathan had always envisioned, and now it was real. This was the Sunset Crest Nathan had always envisioned, and now it was real. As the weeks turned into months, the changes Nathan had set in motion began to ripple throughout Sunset Crest Resort. It was no longer just a place of luxury, where the wealthiest came to enjoy a slice of paradise. It was becoming something much more profound. The resort was undergoing a transformation from within, and that transformation, while initially met with resistance, was now starting to bear fruit. In the beginning, there had been several employees who pushed back against the new policies. Nathan had anticipated this. Change, especially one as fundamental as overhauling an entire culture, was never easy. There were those who clung to the old ways of thinking, who believed that their experience and tenure justified their resistance. For some, the concept of equality and inclusivity felt like a threat to the established order they had thrived in for years. In private meetings, a few of these disgruntled employees voiced their complaints directly to Nathan, hoping to sway him or at least delay the changes. One of them was Paul, a senior member of the concierge team who had been with the resort for over a decade. Paul had built his reputation on providing exceptional service to VIP guests, those who could afford the highest levels of luxury. But it was clear that his idea of exceptional service didn't extend to everyone equally. Nathan had heard reports of how Paul would treat certain guests, those who didn't fit his image of what a Sunset Crest patron should look like, with a subtle but noticeable disdain. Paul had requested a meeting with Nathan after one of the diversity training sessions, a session where he had remained notably quiet. Nathan knew the conversation wouldn't be an easy one. As Paul sat down in Nathan's office, his posture was tense, his face a mask of professional concern. Nathan could see that Paul was struggling to maintain his composure, his discomfort with the changes evident in every gesture. "Mr. Lewis," Paul began, choosing his words carefully. "I've been with Sunset Crest for a long time. I've seen this place grow into one of the top luxury destinations in the country, and I take a lot of pride in the work I've done here. But I have to be honest. Some of these changes you're making, they don't sit well with everyone, especially those of us who have been here from the beginning." Nathan leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady on Paul. He didn't respond immediately, giving Paul the space to continue. Paul cleared his throat and went on. "I understand the importance of inclusivity, of course, but the kind of guests we've always catered to, they expect a certain level of exclusivity. They come here because they want to feel special, unique. They're not looking for a place that feels common, if you understand what I'm saying." Nathan remained silent, letting Paul's words linger in the air. He understood exactly what Paul was saying, and it wasn't just about maintaining high standards of service. It was about maintaining a hierarchy where certain guests, based on their wealth, appearance, or social status, were given preferential treatment, while others were subtly made to feel like outsiders. "I hear you, Paul," Nathan said finally, his tone measured. "You've been here a long time, and your experience is valuable. But let me ask you something. What's the real purpose of providing luxury service? Is it to make people feel special, or is it to make them feel superior to others?" Paul blinked, clearly not expecting the question. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Well, I suppose it's both. Our guests pay for the best, and they expect to be treated accordingly." Nathan nodded slowly. "I agree. They do expect the best. But the best service doesn't mean treating one group of people as more deserving than another. What I'm trying to build here, Paul, is a place where everyone, whether they're paying for the penthouse suite or a standard room, feels like they belong. That's the difference between exclusivity and elitism. I want our guests to feel valued, but not at the expense of making others feel unwelcome." Paul's face tightened, his frustration evident. "But Mr. Lewis, we've always thrived on being exclusive. That's what attracts high-profile guests. If we start treating everyone the same, won't we lose that appeal?" Nathan smiled faintly, leaning forward slightly. "Let me tell you something about exclusivity, Paul. It's a concept that's changing. The world is changing. people don't just want luxury anymore. They want meaning. They want to stay at places that reflect their values, that make them feel good, not just about the service they're receiving, but about the place they're supporting. Sunset Crest isn't just about providing luxury accommodations. It's about setting a new standard for what luxury should mean, and that includes inclusivity. Paul opened his mouth to protest further, but Nathan continued before he could speak. I know this is difficult for some people to accept, and I'm not asking anyone to abandon their standards of service. In fact, I'm asking you to raise them. Treat every guest like they're VIP, not because of what they paid, but because they chose to be here. If you're not willing to embrace that, then I'm afraid Sunset Crest may not be the right place for you anymore. Paul stared at Nathan, his frustration giving way to realization. He knew what Nathan was saying. It was clear that this wasn't just a temporary shift. This was the new direction of the resort, and if he couldn't adapt, there would be no place for him here. After a long pause, Paul nodded slowly, though Nathan could see the internal struggle in his eyes. I understand, Paul said quietly. I'll do my best to adjust. Nathan nodded, sensing that while Paul wasn't fully on board yet, the seed had been planted. That's all I ask, he said. Give it a real chance. I think you'll find that the change we're making will actually enhance the guest experience, not diminish it. As Paul left the office, Nathan knew that not everyone would make the transition. Some, like Paul, might try but ultimately fail to embrace the new values. Others might choose to leave on their own, unwilling to work in a place that no longer catered to elitist ideals. But for every person who resisted, Nathan also saw others who were thriving in the new environment. One of those was Maria, a young woman who worked in the resort's housekeeping department. From the very beginning of the changes, Maria had embraced the new culture wholeheartedly. She had always been quiet, almost invisible to the guests, but Nathan had noticed her during one of the early diversity training sessions. While others sat with folded arms and skeptical expressions, Maria had been fully engaged, nodding along and taking notes. A few weeks after the changes had been implemented, Nathan began to hear more and more about Maria. Guests had started leaving positive feedback about her in their reviews, praising her for going above and beyond to make them feel welcome. She didn't just clean their rooms. She left personal touches that made each guest feel seen. A handwritten note, a folded towel in the shape of a swan, a vase of fresh flowers. Her small gestures weren't part of any official policy. They were just her way of making sure that every guest, no matter who they were, felt valued. Nathan decided to meet with Maria personally, intrigued by her quiet yet impactful influence. When she entered his office, she looked nervous, unsure why the owner of the resort wanted to speak with her. Maria, Nathan began, offering her a warm smile. I've been hearing some wonderful things about the work you've been doing. Guests have been leaving rave reviews about your personal touches. I just wanted to thank you for embodying exactly what we're trying to achieve here. Maria blushed slightly, clearly flustered by the attention. Oh, thank you, Mr. Lewis. I love working here, and I want to make sure the guests feel welcome. I know it sounds silly, but I always think about how I'd want to be treated if I were staying at a place like this. Nathan's smile widened. It doesn't sound silly at all. In fact, it's exactly the mindset we need. I want you to know that your work is being noticed, not just by the guests, but by me as well. Maria's eyes lit up, and for the first time, she seemed to relax. Thank you, she said softly. That really means a lot. Nathan leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. Maria, I'm looking for people to step up into leadership roles as we continue to evolve. I think you have the kind of mindset that could really help shape the future of this resort. Have you ever thought about moving into a management position?" Maria blinked in surprise, clearly caught off guard by the offer. "Me? I've never been in management before. I'm not sure if I'm qualified." Nathan chuckled softly. Leadership isn't always about qualifications on paper. It's about the ability to inspire others and to lead by example. You've already proven that you can do that. I'd like you to consider it." Maria's face flushed again, but this time with excitement. I would love that," she said, her voice barely containing her enthusiasm. "I never thought I'd have the chance. Thank you, Mr. Lewis." As she left the office, Nathan felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was what the transformation of Sunset Crest was all about. Lifting up those who had been overlooked, giving opportunities to people who embodied the new values he wanted to instill in the resort. Maria's rise was just the beginning. Over time, as more employees, like Maria, stepped into leadership roles, the atmosphere of Sunset Crest began to change in noticeable ways. The rigid hierarchy that had once defined the resort started to soften. Guests no longer felt the unspoken divide between those who belonged and those who didn't. Instead, they were welcomed with genuine warmth, regardless of their background or the size of their bank account. The transformation wasn't without its bumps. There were still moments of resistance, still those who struggled to let go of the past. But Nathan remained steadfast, guiding the resort through its growing pains with a clear vision for the future. And as the resort continued to thrive, becoming known not just for its luxury, but for its inclusivity and progressive values, Nathan knew that Sunset Crest had become more than just a successful business. It had become a symbol of what was possible when people chose to embrace change, to rise above prejudice, and to create something better together. The transformation of Sunset Crest Resort had begun to ripple out beyond the walls of the hotel itself. What had started as a shift in culture was now becoming a full-blown reimagining of what the resort represented, not just to its guests and staff, but to the broader hospitality industry. Nathan's vision of a place where luxury and inclusivity coexisted was becoming a reality, and the world was taking notice. News of the changes at Sunset Crest began to spread. Initially, it was through word of mouth. Guests who had stayed at the resort during its early days of transformation shared their experiences on social media. They talked about the personalized service, the warmth of the staff, and the sense of belonging that permeated every aspect of their stay. These weren't just reviews of another high-end hotel. They were testimonials of a place that made them feel more than just catered to. They felt welcomed, no matter who they were. Influencers and travel bloggers picked up on the buzz, visiting the resort themselves to see if the stories they had heard were true. And when they did, they found that the reality exceeded their expectations. They wrote glowing reviews, took photos of the resort's stunning architecture, and shared videos of the small, thoughtful touches that had become the hallmark of Sunset Crest. The folded towels shaped like animals, the handwritten notes from housekeeping, the diverse staff who greeted them with genuine warmth. These elements painted a picture of a resort that was as luxurious as ever, but now with a heart. Soon, larger media outlets began to take notice. Major travel magazines featured Sunset Crest in their top destinations of the year lists, not just for its opulence, but for its commitment to redefining what luxury could mean. Articles were written about the resort's transformation, highlighting Nathan's leadership and his focus on creating an inclusive, welcoming environment for all. Interviews with guests, employees, and Nathan himself became common, and the resort was being hailed as a pioneer in the new age of hospitality. But while the external recognition was gratifying, Nathan's focus remained on the internal culture of the resort. He knew that success couldn't just be measured by accolades and headlines. It had to be reflected in the day-to-day interactions between staff and guests, and among the staff themselves. That's where the real change had to take root. And for that change to be lasting, it needed the buy-in of the entire team, from the top-tier managers to the newest hires. There were still moments of resistance, of course. A few employees continued to struggle with the new expectations. Some left voluntarily, unwilling or unable to align with the values Nathan was instilling. Others were let go after it became clear they were actively working against the new direction. But for the most part, the resistance was waning. The majority of the staff had begun to embrace the changes, realizing that these new values didn't just improve the guest experience, they improved the working environment too. Among the staff, there were stories of personal growth and redemption. One of the most notable transformations was that of Mr. Thompson. After being removed from his position as manager, many had assumed he would leave the resort, unable to accept his demotion. But instead, Thompson surprised everyone by requesting to stay on in a lower role. Nathan had been skeptical at first, wondering if the man could truly adjust to this new reality. But Thompson had shown a willingness to learn, to accept responsibility for his actions, and to take part in the same training programs that everyone else had gone through. Over time, Thompson became a different kind of leader, no longer burdened by the need to exert authority or maintain a rigid hierarchy. He began to focus on mentoring younger employees, helping them navigate the challenges of working in a high-pressure environment. He no longer carried the condescending air of superiority that had once defined him. Instead, he became a quiet, steady presence in the background, contributing to the resort's success in ways he never had before. One day, after months of watching Thompson's progress, Nathan called him into his office. Thompson entered, his demeanor humble but composed, clearly wondering why he had been summoned. Nathan motioned for him to sit down, a small smile on his face. "Mr. Thompson," Nathan began, "you've been through a lot of changes since we last spoke about your role here. I'll admit, when I first removed you from management, I wasn't sure how you'd handle it. But I've been watching, and I want to acknowledge the effort you've made to adapt." Thompson nodded, though his expression remained cautious. "Thank you, Mr. Lewis. It's been a learning experience, that's for sure. I've had to confront a lot of things about myself, about how I used to manage. But I'm grateful for the opportunity to stay here, to be part of this." Nathan leaned forward, his eyes focused on Thompson's. "You've done more than just stay. You've helped foster this new culture in ways that I didn't expect. You've shown that people can change if they're willing to, and I think it's time we recognize that." Thompson blinked, clearly unsure of what Nathan was leading up to. "I'd like to offer you a new role," Nathan continued, "not as a manager in the traditional sense, but as a mentor to the staff. Someone who can help guide them, especially the newer employees, and make sure they understand the values we're building here. You've earned it." For the first time in the conversation, Thompson's face lit up. It wasn't the look of a man receiving a title or authority. It was the look of someone who had found a new purpose. "I'd be honored," he said quietly. Nathan smiled. "Good. You've come a long way, and I think you have a lot more to offer this place." Thompson left the office that day with a renewed sense of purpose, and word quickly spread among the staff about his new role. It became a symbol of the larger transformation happening at Sunset Crest, a place where even those who had once resisted change could find redemption if they were willing to grow. As for Nathan, the transformation of Sunset Crest was deeply personal. This wasn't just a business venture for him. It was a testament to the values he held dear, values that had been hard-won through years of facing prejudice, bias, and exclusion himself. To now be in a position where he could create a space that actively fought against those very forces felt like a full-circle moment. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon and the resort was bathed in the soft golden light of dusk, Nathan stood on one of the balconies overlooking the property. The view was breathtaking, the waves gently lapping at the shore, the lights of the resort twinkling as guests moved about, enjoying the luxury and tranquility Sunset Crest had become famous for. But it wasn't the view that captured Nathan's attention. It was the feeling that this place, this resort, that had once been a symbol of exclusivity and elitism, had transformed into something far greater. It had become a symbol of progress, of what was possible when people chose to build something new, something better. Nathan knew that the journey wasn't over. There would always be challenges, always new obstacles to overcome. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had succeeded in creating not just a business, but a legacy, one that would stand as a beacon for others in the industry, a model for how luxury and inclusivity could go hand in hand. As he stood there, reflecting on the journey, Maria approached quietly, standing beside him on the balcony. She had grown into her new leadership role with grace, becoming a vital part of the resort's success. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said softly, looking out at the view. Nathan nodded. "It is, but it's more than just the view. It's the people, the energy here. It's different now. It feels right." Maria smiled, her eyes filled with admiration for what Nathan had built. "You've created something incredible here. It's not just a resort anymore. It's something people will remember." Nathan looked at her, grateful for her words, but also knowing that it had taken more than just him to make this happen. "We created this, Maria. You, the staff, the guests, everyone who chose to be part of this. It's a collective effort." Maria nodded, understanding. "Still, it started with you." Nathan didn't respond immediately. He simply gazed out at the horizon, letting the peace of the moment wash over him. The journey had been long, filled with obstacles, resistance, and moments of doubt. But standing here, surrounded by the beauty of the resort and the community he had fostered, he knew it had all been worth it. Sunset Crest had become more than just a luxury destination. It had become a symbol of what could be achieved when people came together with a shared vision of inclusivity, respect, and progress. And for Nathan, that was the true measure of success. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, Nathan allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The future was bright, not just for Sunset Crest, but for the people whose lives had been touched by its transformation. And in that moment, Nathan knew that this was just the beginning of something far greater than he had ever imagined. Sunset Crest was thriving, not just as a resort, but as a living, breathing example of what it meant to lead with purpose, integrity, and heart. And for Nathan, there was no greater victory.